Radhika is a professor at the Department of Political Studies at the University of Manitoba. She's the director of the Geopolitical Economy Research Group and the convener of the International Manifesto Group. She has written numerous books, including her previous volume, Geopolitical Economy After U.S. Hegemony, Globalization and Empire. And also, I should mention that today we are talking about her most recent book, Capitalism, Coronavirus, and War, A Geopolitical Economy. And that book has been made publicly available, free to download as a PDF, thanks to support from the foundation Knowledge Unlatched. So with that, Radhika, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks so much, Ben, for agreeing to chair this. I just also want to say thanks to all the speakers who have so graciously devoted their time and their effort to doing this and to engaging with what I have to say. I feel all at once honored, touched, humbled, and absolutely delighted to have this engagement and to share our thoughts. I'm going to respond in the order in which people spoke and made their points. Obviously, the richness of the contributions means that if I respond to all of them, we'll be here for many more hours. So I will try to select some main points to which I would like to address my remarks. So first of all, Robert, you started by saying that, often scholars focus on what is changing and not enough on what has not changed. And this sort of relates very directly to a point I find myself making very often, and a point that I've made both in Geopolitical Economy and in Capitalism, Coronavirus, and War. And that is that since about 1914, which I have taken in my analysis to be the high point of imperialism, we have been experiencing a decline of imperialism. That's like now more than nearly 110 years of this decline. So it's clearly not as fast as I would like. And I am painfully aware of this. So the statistics that you present about the United States' might and power are sobering and interesting, but I would also like to put them in a larger context, the kind of context in which I would see them. So first of all, I would like to say that, to talk about multipolarity, to talk about the decentering or the displacement of the United States and more generally Western countries from the being the center of gravity of the world economy does not necessarily require that all the countries become as rich as the United States in terms of GDP, etc. Because I think that already a certain level of productive capacity, of political stability, cohesion, etc., is already enough to prevent the United States from imposing its will on these countries. The United States, I'm sure, the United States has basically lost every war that it has fought, except when it comes to overrunning tiny countries like Grenada or Panama. So in that sense, its ability to subordinate other countries has always been relatively questionable, but nevertheless, so it cannot do it by force or anything. And the United States would today, for example, I'm sure love to overrun Iran or what have you, but they cannot, because the fact of the matter is such a conflict would be too costly and not necessarily winnable. Secondly, I want to elaborate on a point that Michael made. I think that, Michael, I thought your expression empty GDP was a very valid one. I think that there is such a thing as empty GDP. And to your point about healthcare, the example that you gave, I would also like to add, of course, the military-industrial complex. And on top of that, which, does not increase anybody's well-being, but counts massively in, the United States spends some $1 trillion on its military. So that's 1 out of $20 trillion of US GDP is accounted for by this thing that does not really improve anybody's welfare. But in addition to that, I want to draw people's attention to the research of Jacob Asser in particular, who talks about the financialization of GDP and the extent to which in the United States in particular, particular, a combination of the increase of financial activity and certain changes made to the way in which GDP statistics are compiled in the United States, it really exaggerates the size of the US economy. And this this is an important thing that one should keep an attention to. Thirdly, I'd like to say that, in my book, I've tried anyway to see as a good Marxist, as I still consider them myself, although I have criticisms of most of what passes for Marxism as well. But nevertheless, I try to see the contradiction in the picture. From the graphs that you were showing, it was very clear that the United States has been, gaining in GDP and in per capita GDP and what have you. But what's also clear is that a lot of this gain has come at the expense of its so-called allies. And to me, this is also a contradiction, which you are seeing played out right now in Europe, where the United States is asking, and so far European countries seem to be complying in essentially acquiescing in the deindustrialization of Europe, which is quite serious. However, the question remains, how long are ordinary Europeans, but also how long are European capitalists going to necessarily put up with this? I don't know that I know the answer to that, but I think it's an interesting point. And then finally, I'd just like to say that what you don't really, as I've already pointed out in by pointing out the need to look at what people like Jacob Assa are saying, on the whole, even when you talk about US corporations, showing how dominant they are. I mean, Michael, you contested this by saying that, the US corporations try not to show profit, but I think this may actually be in Robert's favor. If they are not trying to show profit and then still apparently making so much profit, then Robert's point is further reinforced. But what I would like to say is that actually Nicholas Shaxson in his book Treasure Islands, where he examines the role of all these Bermuda, Bahamas or wherever, these places where you sequester your money. In this book, he says that, of course, the UK is the biggest treasure island in the world. And I would say that the United States in recent decades has been, on the whole, essentially following a UK-style financialization strategy. And so it has also become a treasure island. So in a certain sense, I would say that it would be interesting to see whether companies do not have a tax incentive in reporting higher profits in the United States. I think that that would also have to be taken into account. And finally, also, this statistic that you are sharing, which is compiled by Forbes, which says, these are the top 2,000 companies and so on. In these top 2,000 companies, this statistic is arrived at, it's from what I understand, by using a combination of assets, size of assets, market value, profits, sales, things like that. But certainly in the calculating the size of assets, and certainly in calculating market value, and possibly also in profits, the role of financialization is not taken into account. I mean, if you see how absurdly high the market valuation of US corporations is today, how completely out of whack it is from the actual value of these corporations and the profitability of these corporations, which we saw particularly during the pandemic, when the economy was tanking and stock markets were going in the other direction. All of this is the result of vast quantities of money creation that we saw. We have seen actually over the last decade and a half, since the 2008 financial crisis. And I would say, in fact, going back earlier, Michael and I sometimes dispute this, but I think that easy monetary policy actually began under Alan Greenspan early in the 21st century. And then he was forced to interrupt it by increasing interest rates to about 5% in the mid 2000s, which basically became the needle that pricked the housing and credit bubble. But anyway, all of this, and plus also, of course, Greta Krippner's very interesting, now quite old analysis, but I'm sure it's still valid, about the financialization of productive corporations. So the extent to which the profits are made out of finance should also be looked at. So all in all, I would say that this is the broader frame within which I would examine these statistics that you showed. Finally, because you don't pay attention to financialization, which, those are most of the people who do tend to pay attention to it from a critical point of view, regarding it as something highly problematic. So you are not necessarily paying attention to, the underlying productive capacities and technological capacities and so on. And there is, the very famous report by ASPI, which is, I think, it's an Australian outfit that is very pro-war and so on. I think Australian Strategic Policy Institute. And their report says that China has a global lead, according to them, in 37 out of 44 technologies which they are now tracking, covering a crucial technology field spanning defense, space, robotics, energy, the environment, biotechnology, artificial intelligence, advanced materials, key quantum computing areas. Now you may say that, an organization like ASPI is trying to be like a Cassandra, it's trying to predict what it wishes to prevent. Fine, it may be so, but certainly that's what they are saying. And I think on the ground, I think both Ruslan and Michael have emphasized the extent to which the US strategy in recent decades has actually been to not be a maker, but to be a taker. And this already is, vis-a-vis the whole world. So this already, while it may for the moment show that, the profits that you are showing is part of the taking, but this taking is based on an extremely volatile and unstable foundation, which we are now seeing the earthquake that is taking place in this foundation. So those are, I guess, some of my, and I guess I should say one final thing, which I think was both you and Jayati raised this question. So, you say, well, is China socialist? So obviously, my usual answer to this question is, yes, there are many capitalists in China. Yes, in China, there's also a lot of inequality. Yes, these capitalists are some of the biggest corporations in the world. Yes, these capitalists are also members of the Communist Party. But, and this is the point Jayati also made, and it's just, she sees this as not a sign of socialism. And so we are maybe getting into a bit of a semantic debate. But I think, to me, the most important thing about China is that in China, the reins of policy are not held in the hands of the collective corporate capitalist class. They are held in the hands of the party state. Now, you may find many faults with what the party state is doing, whether it's socialist, whether its policy is sufficiently socialist or not. But the fact of the matter is that it seems to me, and I'm happy to discuss this further, and I will revise my view in light of what you say, but it seems to me that the party state it has in its own interest the need to maintain its legitimacy within the country. And today, from what I can see, it has vast legitimacy, far greater legitimacy than the governments of so-called democratic countries in the Western countries. And in order to maintain this legitimacy, which is, by the way, also an important resource for the Chinese, in terms of expanding its capacity to do things, the party state has to do certain minimal number of things that are socialistic. And I think that this is, to me, this is what makes China socialist. I'll come back to that point a little later as well. But these were my responses to Robert's question. With Victor Gao, of course, I agree with a lot of what he said. I believe that manufacturing matters. At the end of the day, you cannot just be a taker. You also have to be a maker. I was also particularly agreed with the points he made about advances in military technology, because to me, it demonstrates another really interesting aspect, perhaps shall we say contradiction, of the US situation, where the US spends more on its military than the next XYZ, whatever it is, dozen, 20, 24, however, it depends on the year in which it's measured, states combined. Fine. So you're spending all this money, but in fact, you cannot get your military industrial complex to make the weapons that will allow you to win any wars. I mean, right now, China and Russia are producing weapons that are far more technologically sophisticated from what I understand. I'm not a military technologist, but I try to read about this as much as I can understand. And they are producing these weapons, which the US is coddled military industrial complex cannot produce. When Putin announced announced that Russia can now make hypersonic missiles and that they have demonstrated it, this was back in 2018. Apparently, the Pentagon had a Sputnik moment. That is to say, the Russians are once again ahead in a very important technology, which the Americans still have not been able to replicate, precisely because their military industrial complex does not exist to produce effective weapons. It exists to swallow government largesse. And as a consequence, you have this very problematic scenario. So I agree particularly with Victor Gao's points, I mean, I will concede to him. I don't know as much as I should about this coming digital technological revolution, etc., etc. But I would say that the recent even before the recent strides made by Huawei by producing this chip that is essentially the equivalent of what the United States does not want it to import, I was already saying that the Chinese have demonstrated a remarkable capacity to forge ahead on technological innovation. I mean, it seems to me that the party state has the capacity to essentially accomplish any goals that it sets itself. You roll up your sleeves and get down to it. And you can, if the United States doesn't want you to have certain technologies, they will make their own. I mean, this is, at the end of the day, technologies in the US are produced by human beings. In China also, there are human beings. There are, all of them have, if the state invests enough in education, training, scientific personnel, these states can do what the United States has done. So, and finally, I also would like to say that, these statistics that we can see of, great US power and so on, does not explain US belligerence. If the US is doing so well, why is it being so belligerent? Why is it losing its purchase over the rest of the world? And I think there, and developments in the rest of the world. And there again, Victor Gao's points about China wanting peace and development, I think have to be taken seriously. Again, Jayati said, that China does not have the same imperial background and so on. And I completely agree with that. But I would also add further that actually what China has been doing is bending over backwards to achieve peace. And one can give various examples, whereas the United States has been leaning forward as much as possible into provoking and inciting war. So that's those were my remarks about Victor Gao. I would particularly like to thank Jayati for all her three major points that she made, which were very, to me, very thought-provoking, and I want to say something about them all. But I just want to correct one small problem, and I agree with an enormous amount of what Jayati said, of course, is that I actually do not argue that this is the end of the neoliberal era. I was wrong-footed once when 2008 happened. I published a column saying that this is the end of neoliberalism, and then I had to rethink my understanding of what neoliberalism was. Neoliberalism is not about markets. Neoliberalism is about the power of big corporations. For the last 40 years, we have had governments of both so-called right, well, the real right and the so-called left, which have been devoted to nothing more than the advancement of the power of big corporate interests. That is neoliberalism. That is not going anywhere. And in fact, what I say in one of the chapters of my book, which is, I think, called Know Your Enemy, pseudo-civic neoliberalism versus neo-fascism, what I actually point out is that Western countries are today facing a prospect of either a transition to a new phase of neoliberalism. So to me, you had classic neoliberalism in the 80s, you had globalization neoliberalism in the 90s, you had empire neoliberalism in the 2000s, you had austerity neoliberalism in the 2010s, and now we are going to make a shift either, so we could be making a shift to what I call pseudo-civic neoliberalism, in which what will happen is that the government, in the name of addressing pressing social problems and economic problems and so on, will essentially engage in public-private partnerships, or whatever they're called, in depending on the country. In Britain, they're called private finance initiatives. They will essentially contract with corporations to produce certain things which they may well provide the public with for either very cheaply or for free, but out of which corporations will make an enormous quantity of enormous profits, enormous money, without taking any risk whatsoever. So this will all look as though, all these wonderful corporations are providing us with these wonderful things, vaccines or hospitals or what have you. But this is, so that is the direction in which the Biden types are going to take us. But this completely forgets that 40 years of neoliberalism and the failures of the left in the neoliberal context have produced forces further to the right of this as well, so that you have the Trumpists, the neo-fascists, and so on. So today the transition to a new phase of neoliberalism, or something which is, I don't know whether it's worse or better, but it will certainly be a lot more chaotic, which is some kind of neo-fascist authoritarian type of alternative, which are the two options available to people today in Western countries. Also, I also agree with Jayati that neoliberalism has not died in third world countries. Unfortunately, as we saw in Brazil under Bolsonaro, or today with Modi in India, these governments remain committed to more neoliberal policies than they should, in a certain sense, than is good for these countries to advance productively, to advance economically. But nevertheless, they exist, and there are far too many such forces. But at the same time, I would like to say that, the exhaustion of capitalism, its conversion into a decaying neoliberal, financialized, militarized form of capitalism it's basically not going to, it's less and less of an option in more and more third world countries. So they will be seeking alternatives, and as they seek alternatives, the example and the partnership of China will entice them, at least in a different direction. Obviously, China is different in one very critical respect. China has a revolutionary party state. It's not easy to invent revolutions. It's not a question of policy. There will have to be social and political changes in other countries for other countries to even begin to emulate what China has been able to do. And it is not at all guaranteed. But I would say that certainly the historical pressure is going in that direction. But historical pressure by itself is nothing. Human beings have to become conscious of the choices they face and make the right choices. That has to happen as well. So when Jayati says we are in the Western world anyway going into a new kind of neoliberalism, I agree. But I also think that for the rest of the world, the example and the partnership of China are there. And I've also said in writing that for other countries, just to partner with China may not be enough. They will have to learn to emulate China, to engage in industrial policy, to engage in state-directed development of the sort, Robert, that you have written about so much. Okay, so then Jayati's next point is that the pandemic is endogenous to capitalism. I actually agree. I think that's what you were saying, and I actually agree. I also think that climate change, I mean, if you look at, is endogenous to capitalism, particularly neoliberal capitalism, and this is evidenced by the fact that for any major index of showing environmental degradation, whether it's rising temperatures or rising pollution, loss of biodiversity, etc., any graph that you see takes a steep upward trajectory after circa 1980. So in that sense, neoliberalism actually, people often say that growth and environmental protection are not, they are incompatible. But the fact of the matter is, over the last 40 years, neoliberalism has given us low growth combined with high levels of environmental destruction. And in that sense, I agree that it is internal to this, and if Jayati knows, of course, much better than me what bodies how bodies like the WHO operate and what they are thinking and so on. But I think that if the WHO thinks that climate change is going to bring us more climate change related pandemics, I would not be at all surprised. It is the manner in which capitalism is destroying the environment that is due to this. Finally, I've learned a lot from Jayati's writing exactly about this whole issue of whether price rises have been prompted by the Ukraine conflict and so on, food price rises. I think that she's right. Jayati has made a very important point that it's speculation that has raised the prices of food in the rest of the world. So it's not the war itself. And in fact, I think that the food price issue has been politicized for that reason, to divert attention away from the real reasons. But there's also another politicization, which is that Western agribusiness is invested in Ukraine and Ukrainian agriculture up to its gills. So a large part of this whole deal about getting grain out of Ukraine is about getting the grain that Western agribusiness will profit out of, and it will not profit from it unless it is actually sold. So the desperation to get this grain out of Ukraine is because of that. So I completely agree with you, and I also loved Jayati's phrase that this is a war between the producers war between the producers of the means of production and the producers of the means of destruction. I thought that was very, very beautifully put. And in fact, Jayati also seemed to imply that the military-industrial complex may well have replaced the fire sector, the finance, insurance, and real estate sector as central. Although in my book, I've said that these sectors, as well as other sectors such as big pharma and so on, that rely on intellectual property right compliance, are all part of this core of the US, and which is partly what is making the US so militarily aggressive. Yeah. And then finally, Jayati raised the question of, is China socialist? And I would say that, basically, we can debate this till the cows come home. I think we agree, Jayati and I agree on the nature of the Chinese regime. I choose to call it socialist, and Jayati doesn't, which is then a semantic matter. But what I do feel is that as we live in a time when capitalism is visibly decaying, then the rest of the world, policymakers and ordinary people and people who are politically active will see that some other route is necessary than handing over the reins of the economy to a bunch of capitalists in your society. And as that route is taken, and hopefully it is taken in as democratic a way as possible, in ways that enhance popular power rather than diminish it, I think that we will be marching towards some kind of socialism. Yes, and then finally, Jayati did also say that she feels that China's relations with the rest of the world are not relations where China is being a benign aid in development or anything, but rather that China is playing an extractivist role. But I've been very interested in this question, and I've read a lot about, particularly of the work that has been produced by Deborah Broughtingham and her team at the the Center for Research in China. Anyway, it is CARI, C-A-R-I, China Africa Research Initiative. Sorry, that's the correct, at Johns Hopkins University. And I think that she has demonstrated that China's investments are not entirely focused on extraction alone. China also makes investments in production, in manufacturing, and so on and so forth. But I stand to be corrected if my sources are wrong. Further, then I would say that, and finally, I agree completely with Jayati's understanding of human progress. It is not about GDP, particularly now that GDP has become such a corrupted figure that does not really measure human welfare very significantly at all. So in that sense, I would say, and that's partly why it's important to know that in order to develop, one does not need to match US GDP. What one needs to focus on, what policymakers and governments need to focus on, is how do you enhance the development possibilities of the people of your country. Ruslan, thank you so much for reading as closely as you have my book, and I particularly appreciated that very much. I feel that we, of course, we share so much of our perspectives, of our understanding, and so on. And I would say that your understanding, you picked up on some very key things that I feel are important in what I'm doing. The first is that the reason why I call what I do geopolitical economy, which is the title of my 2013 book and it's in the subtitle of my new book, the reason for that is that I think you cannot understand international relations or geopolitics in isolation from what is happening in the economy. In that sense, I'm a bit of an Engelsian. You know, Engels wrote this very important book, The Role of Force in History, and he related it. The ability to win militarily is connected with your industrial capacity and all of these things. So to me, and of course, military conflicts are also about the question of productive capacity and of course, appropriating capacity and so on. So in that sense, I think that you described what I'm trying to do in terms of explaining the current war in the context of what has happened since 2008, but also I would say what has happened since 1980, since the onset of neoliberalism. This is very, very important. Yes, and so I'm just trying to yes. And I think also, yes, I did want to come back on, you know, I have no doubt that you are right, that Russia, the Russian state as it exists, and you as a leftist, a good leftist, you are very critical of what the Russian state is doing. And I have no doubt that the Russian state is essentially aiding its Russian capitalists to try to dominate the post-Soviet space and so on. And I also feel that countries like India, say, for example, will be trying, capitalist countries like India will also be trying to advance the interests of their corporations with whatever sort of imperialist policies that they can come up with. But the key thing for me is that the kind of imperial policies that are today possible for countries like Russia or India are nowhere near as strong as what was possible for the traditional imperialist countries with the onset of capitalism. And the simple reason for that is the spread of multipolarity. That is to say, the increasing capacity of more and more countries to produce from abject poverty to something, a decent standard of living, and certainly to have militaries that are able to resist and governments and popular expectations that are able to resist imperial subordination, puts very serious limits to what is possible today. So in that sense, I entirely agree with you. And I also think that your analysis presents a deeper appreciation, I think, of the causes of the war in this particular aspect, the way in which what Russians want, what the Russian capitalists rather want, and what the Western imperialist states and corporate capital wanted, they were in conflict. I think that was a very deep insight, and I really appreciated it. Okay, and then finally, Michael, obviously, you and I have just so many agreements that I'm just want to say I'm very grateful for your presentation of what you considered to be the strengths of my book, which I think you are absolutely accurate. You are particularly accurate to focus on the whole issue of financialization and the extent to which this particular phenomena represents the decay of Western capitalism. So that I entirely agree with you. As I said earlier, I loved your expression empty GDP. And also your very interesting discussion of profits. I mean, I think there was one problematic point you made, but all the other points you made were completely valid. And the fact of the matter is that the ability to take profits is not necessarily a mark of strength, and nor is it a mark of stability. On the contrary, it shows that the United States and US capital, both domestically and internationally, is standing on extremely shaky foundations, and they can be brought down by anything. On your point about MMT, I'll just say, I always say about MMT the same thing. It's not that I disagree with the rational kernel of MMT, which is that government, that if the government created money, it would be no less inflationary than if it borrowed money. And I'm totally for creating rather than borrowing money, because borrowing money just gives rich people a double like a double deal. On the one hand, they are not taxed because the government is borrowing, and on the other hand, they are given an asset, an income earning asset that they will have instead of being taxed. And somebody asks here what MMT means. MMT is modern monetary theory, the theory that became very famous in the run-up to the last US elections, because everybody thought that President Biden would accept it and there would be an era of government largesse and so on. But see, my difficulty with MMT is this. Number one, there are 2 or 3 points. Number one, as I like to say, I like to use what George Bernard Shaw said about somebody's book about MMT. There's much in MMT that is true and much that is new, but what is true is not new, and what is new is not true. So that's the first point. The second point, so because Keynes said more or less the same thing. I mean, Keynes, we already have that understanding from Keynes. So the next point I want to make is that MMT has this notion of monetary sovereignty. Then, any monetarily sovereign government can, make as much money as it likes, but then it has had to withdraw this and say, well, maybe not all countries, well, maybe only the United States, etc. So if what they're talking about is that the United States has the right to print as much money as it likes, then what they are actually doing is they are participating in imperialist wishful thinking. Because first of all, it is imperialist in the sense that they understand this as the unique exorbitant privilege of the United States. And it is wishful because actually the United States does not actually have that right. The fact of the matter is that beyond a point, the printing of money is going to lead to a decline in the value of the US dollar. And it is going to make the US dollar less attractive. And so, and that's partly why, by the way, after Biden came to power and he announced all these spending programs, first of all, the spending programs were very modest. And secondly, they were accompanied by considerable increases in taxation. If it was so easy for the United States to print more money, why did they not just do it? They didn't do it. So that's a final, that's my main point. But for the rest, I mean, obviously, Michael, I think that all your analysis of the way in which the fire sector is undermining both production and consumption of necessary things in US life and elsewhere, I think is absolutely right. Your example of Thames Water was brilliant in showing how profits are made today. And I think that is also something we should factor in when we are thinking about, well, if US corporations are appropriating so much profit, that this is a great thing. No, this is happening in a way that is going to be deeply destabilizing, both in the United States and the US. And that's why I have taken these two, and the UK, sorry. These two countries are my models because they are countries in which this type of capitalism has gone the furthest. And it is not a surprise that it is the politics of these countries that are the most chaotic, the most destabilized and broken, really broken is what it is. That's why you have a plethora of new writing in the United States about whether the United States is going to experience another civil war. And who knows what's going to happen in the next year and a half before the next US election. So I guess I should conclude all of this, come to the conclusion. Now I've responded to all the points, and I once again would like to thank all the speakers for participating in this and saying such amazing things important things about the main thing, which is really trying to understand the historical moment in which we are living right now, and why we are experiencing such a plethora of crises. So, or rather than the crises of plethora, which was, of course, a term used about capitalism. So thanks very much. And thanks again to the speakers and to Ben.
I'm Michael Hudson. I'm appearing here for the International Manifesto Group. If you like this video and ones like it, please subscribe. For more information, go to the address on the screen.